How's your podcast going?
Yeah, so the old one is dead, but it's paved the way for the rebirth of a new podcast.
Okay, why did
Uh,
you kill it? Why would you do such a thing?
I just had changes in my own life. I couldn't maintain it, but those changes have since reversed, and I have more free time than ever. And also, I just decided that an interview
Sounds
podcast is really just much more coherent way to reach people. Like before, I was basically just laying out like layers and layers of political theory, and
yeah.
turns out, people are not too into that, probably rightfully. And I think the new podcast has seen a lot more success. It's from the New World podcast, started 3 weeks ago, and it's been doing great. It's been like 10x my old numbers. That's quite good.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So where is all of your political thought being placed then? You're writing articles?
Right. Yeah. So in the kind of hiatus, I had a lot of time writing on Substack, cactus.substack.com,
Yeah.
and then you can find the podcast there too. And then I think in the newer podcast as well, even though it's a kind of dialogue, you can still hear a lot of my thought across. That's something that I've actually thought is very nice about your show as well as mine, where you can feel a kind of coherent perspective come across, even though the person in the other chair is different every time.
hmm hmm So what's the basis of your political thought?
That's a good question. I don't know. I remember when I was here like a year ago. I was here a year ago, and I was basically talking about statistics
hmm
and how even just like a very low number or a very low level of understanding of statistics, like basically what an average is, what like per capita means, basically, and not falling for a lot of these, not falling for a lot of these kind of impulses, a lot of these stories, or a lot of these I don't know, like viral videos and whatnot, that really kind of drive people crazy. So I guess you would describe it as a kind of moderate, maybe like center right kind of. I've called it like impulse control conservatism at some point. I think
Oh,
that's
okay.
kind of apt.
Impulse control conservatism. What is conservatism?
That's a good question. Well, I think maybe I would probably define conservatism quite differently than a lot of people, but in general, in the vaguest sense, it's the preservation of institutions, right? It's the preservation of uh, actions, of understandings, of ways of life that have existed for a long time,
hmm
or that have been proven and tested.
hmm
Uh, and of course, there's a lot of conflict over what are the things that are actually long lasting, what are the things that are actually tested, what are the things that actually work. That's all kind of up for debate. But with
hmm
regards to my kind of thinking, really, I think I've gone, even just in the past few months when I've been doing these interviews, I've gone a bit to the right. Is that I get this sense, or yeah, I get this sense that there is this really, really striking impulse, or really kind of compelling impulse among that has affected me and that has affected a lot of people who I think are on the kind of center left, or who were on the center left of this kind of kind of desire for procedure. And that can be looked at as a strange like mutation of conservatism itself. But this desire of procedure when it comes to things like COVID measures, when it comes to things like even this kind of latest kind of like Elon scandal, the quote unquote like disinformation board and such, there's this kind of attraction to bureaucracy and this attraction to basically methods of resolving conflict that you can articulate, that really has been quite destructive in practice. And so just really like substituting that kind of really like liberal conservatism or bureaucratic conservatism, if you can call it that. I know conservatives wouldn't want to call it that, but this kind of basically institutionalist impulse for a kind of impulse that maybe like for a kind of understanding that maybe is more similar to how I was brought up. I think that has probably moved me a bit to the right.
So let's try to concretize what you mean by this procedural, bureaucratic proceduralism, and specifically in the instance of like conflict resolution. You brought up,
Oh yes.
you said there's an Elon conspiracy, but then you brought up the disinformation board, which is not necessarily, well, I guess they are tied together, right? Because the in the United States, the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, created or rolled out or began to construct openly a disinformation board, led by a singer-songwriter, weird personality, somebody that you would not want to be in high school with, let alone controlling what the truth is. But that seemed to happen directly after Elon Musk moved to acquire Twitter and then began to kind of, well, he's done a lot of things. I don't really understand what he's doing because he went to buy Twitter and then he just started provoking the left pretty hardcore. And now he's bringing up all of these stories that were suppressed by the media about Hillary Clinton, and that's making even CNN is having to scramble and admit that, you know, there was some weird stuff going on in the 2016 election. So there's all that. Whatever he's doing is really disruptive, but I want to understand
Yes.
how that applies to this bureaucratic procedural conflict resolution process and what that has to do with left and right.
Oh man, that's not the angle I expected. So
Okay.
yeah, let's talk about Musk first, because I think you had Curtis Yarvin on, and I'm surprised you didn't talk about this scenario with him, because I think his insight has been really apt here, where he talks about the nature of power. And power is basically this ability to decide how things are perceived and branded, at least in the Yarvin view. And
So
we
there's a
thought,
specific power that is completely synonymous with propaganda.
yes, that's a good term for it.
Okay.
And I think he calls it the cathedral as well. That's the term he uses.
Yeah.
But propaganda is also great. And what Elon showed is that there is a reservoir of this power among people who have these kind of, I'm not sure if the status is the right word, but kind of prestige or reputation. And I say that status isn't the right word because it's not like it's conferred by an institution. It's not like it's conferred by the New York Times. It's not like it's conferred by Harvard. Musk's status comes from his success in his car company, his rocket company, and so on. And a lot of these kind of tech founders, they've kind of been just like seething with rage. Really, I think this is a bit more anecdotal, but really just completely set off, but still feeling like they're trapped, still feeling like they have no power, even though they obviously do.
Okay,
And
hold on.
I think,
You say these tech giants. I think that there's probably a generational difference between different ones. So we could say that there's probably
yes.
Gates. Jobs isn't around anymore. Who knows what he would be thinking about right now? But Gates is in a class of his own. Then you have Bezos, who's probably, I guess he's Gen X, but younger, or at least
Yes.
newer tech than Gates. So he's got a different position, I'm sure. And then there's Jack Dorsey, who founded Twitter, and Mark Zuckerberg, who founded Facebook. And Elon is a part of, I guess he would be more akin to Dorsey and Zucker in his outlook, maybe generationally. But when you bring up
Yeah.
these tech giants, you're saying that there are these really big figures. And I wonder if you're talking about Bezos and Dorsey and Zuckerberg. They're seething with rage, you're saying?
I'm just talking from anecdotal experience about people who are kind of heads of startups who you've probably never heard of,
Okay.
some of which are actually still quite successful, particularly like startups that sell software to other startups that sell software,
Yeah.
basically. But I think David Sachs kind of articulates this very well, or Mike Solana, those kind of figures who kind of represent this more vocal end of tech founders. But I do think that just there's this kind of latent understanding at this point that it's more likely than not. It's kind of similar to the lab leak where everyone kind of gets it now, and even if they might not be like completely certain, there's kind of like an understanding of like yeah this probably happened, and there's this kind of understanding now in Silicon Valley, correct or not, that like yeah these legacy institutions they're kind of like worse. They're kind of worse than the substitute. And I think that's been something that has not been well understood.
What do you mean the substitute?
The substitute being basically whatever. If we were to erase CNN, Fox, MSNBC, and the kind of print outlets as well, what would rise up afterwards? It would probably be a constellation of Substack, a constellation of these kind of insider newsletters like Politico and whatnot, assuming that doesn't get erased as well, and then some kind of podcast circuit, YouTube circuit like this one right here, and
yeah.
So
and it would be based on and I just to clarify, the old institutions, the legacy institutions, they have prestige, and that prestige
yes, that's right.
It was accumulated over time, and Harvard, New York Times, CNN, Fox, they are the big boys. New tech came along, started like YouTube and the podcast circuit began to kind of erode their hold on meaning making or branding or defining phenomena. And if you watch over time, YouTube has kind of slowly allowed CNN and Fox to kind of take over because I guess that's where the money is, and kind of downranked these individual creators. So there's kind of a battle going on between the startups like you and I and, for attention, where everybody's fighting for attention, and then like Tucker Carlson and Don Lemon, whatever. But if we were to demolish those legacy institutions, what we would have then would be reputation. Substack is not Substack. Substack is a bunch of people on Substack, and you have Barry Weiss, you have bigger names, smaller names, and they are generating content, and they're accumulating status, not necessarily prestige, by providing people with what they want or providing a service as individuals. So it's a completely different kind of meaning-making, not meaning-making, but it's status versus reputation, and status is accumulated by doing good work and getting a name for yourself. It's not conferred by an institution. It's conferred by the audience.
Yeah, precisely. And I actually have this interesting divide. This is an idea I'm exploring, that there's basically kind of 3 layers of this. And this is kind of similar to the kind of like midwit meme, right? You've probably seen the midwit meme where the people in the middle are like the people who really dominate these kind of legacy institutions, and the people who are maybe not thinking about it nearly as much, and the people who are thinking about it a lot, they actually agree. And it's quite similar, where the impulse or the kind of appeal, the fundamental like value or aesthetic that you're gaining from a lot of these different outlets can be really divided into 3 parts. So one is a kind of deep emotional resonance, right? So a kind of understanding, or a kind of, yes, that person said that. That person said the thing that I already knew, and I just wanted them to say it. And these kind of alignments of basically very human impulses. Now, impulses can be wrong. They can be, and conservatism, largely I see it as a ideology that seeks to channel those impulses towards something productive. But a lot of these people, their impulses are just being kind of like flatly denied, whether it's on a lot of these kind of bureaucratic problems, whether it's on these kind of like quote unquote culture war stuff, whether it's on COVID, etc.
Could you give an example on how people's impulses are being denied?
Yeah, well, one is just obviously the mask thing. I think Richard Hanania had this tweet that I wasn't able to find later on, but he had this tweet that I think was quite beautiful, where he said, the culture war is not a waste of time. It's about the deep aesthetic preferences of our society, and those are important. And I think it's just been like very striking how there's just no theory of mind. There's no kind of understanding, not even compassion, that's like something else, or like empathy, that's like something else, but not even like an understanding of like, oh, there are a large group of people, perhaps a majority at this point, who really find masks uncomfortable, who really want, intrinsically, they want people to have their show their faces and to be able to see them and be able to connect in this very human way. And of course, you have to balance that against other values. But at this point where anyone who can get a vaccine can get a vaccine, where we've kind of returned to the mode where we're thinking about COVID as a kind of like normal everyday risk compared to all of the other risks we take about our lives, this kind of like just permanent mask regime, even though like ironically this is not something that I cared about a lot at the beginning, right? There are people who are much more prescient about this than I was. That it really is a kind of pointless subjugation of another group of people. And so you get this building pressure of people who obviously have this desire, who have this aesthetic preference, who has this like intrinsic value, and it's not necessarily like a right or wrong answer, it's an intrinsic value, and people are just kind of like stomping over that. Any kind of legacy institution, really. I mean, there are some conservative institutions that have kind of fanned this and kind of drove it in the other direction, try to make people even more angry about it, but I would say like the majority of these legacy institutions have kind of poo-pooed this instinct. And people really want someone to come and say like, this is an obvious truth, that people obviously have this taste and they're not wrong to fight for it politically. And I think that kind of resonance, that kind of idea of truth, or that idea of basically kind of the emperor has no clothes, I think that's one of the primary appeals that are in this new media ecosystem.
Okay, and we're bouncing around a lot, so we're going to try to organize it. Listener, allow us to come and go on these tracks. So, well, you're saying that the people who have a lot of power, but they don't have power, the tech startup guys or the tech maestros, they are looking at the field of contest and they're seeing that the old media is not doing its job, not necessarily of telling the truth, but allowing society to function by appealing or allowing people to live their lives as they want to see fit, or at least express their values. And there's something about the legacy media that's denying these desires, whereas the new media would allow those desires to be expressed and championed and argued for or against.
Right. There's something very specific that irritates all of these tech founders and irritates myself as well, which is that the criticisms coming out of the legacy institutions can be very easily rewritten as a confession to all of their sins of the past few decades. Because you actually look at what they're saying here, what they're accusing people of. The Disinformation Governance Board is probably the best example of this. Putting out completely false and unsourced, baseless accusations. That sounds a lot, and that sounds familiar. Putting out viral or putting out kind of anger inciting pieces or attacks, harassing individual people. All this seems very familiar. It seems like it does seem like a real problem. It does seem like people who I know have experienced this. It does seem like that this atmosphere exists, but I don't really talk to any kind of either far right or like hyper online. Like I don't really interact with these social media people at all. I don't know where, I don't think it's coming from there because I don't even talk to them. Who do I talk to? Who do I interact with? Who is within my social circle and who's causing this? And it's people like Taylor Lorenz, it's people like all of these legacy journos who are doing exactly the same thing, especially when it comes to tech companies. I talked to Rune about this, who is this kind of very funny Twitter.
I want to have him on. Did you have him on your show?
Yeah, he's on.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's on the From the New World podcast. We talked about machine learning, and we talked about a lot of these issues as well. And for the viewers, he's the guy who invented the term word cell. If you haven't heard it before, but not to jump around too much. Let's try to stay a little bit focused here.
Yeah.
What we had was this very effective confession, and what the confession ended with was a complete non sequitur. It wasn't, oh, there has been this widespread destruction of public trust by people who have behaved in, I think, genuinely conspiratorial and false and propagandistic ways. And it didn't end by saying, like, oh, we should really take some measures to rein in the people who have actually acted like this. No, we want to confer to them even more power, which is, of course, the exact opposite of what everything preceding it meant.
Okay, so just to clarify, let's say from the 2016 election on, this is when I started noticing that these institutions are really keen on, well, they perceived Trump as a threat, and so they threw everything at him, and it didn't matter consistency or truth. They played a lot with the emotions, and a lot of people overlooked that because they had painted Trump in such a bad light. And I think worse than he actually is, not to say that he's perfect by any means, but they created and Trump leaned into this because of his pugilistic marketing strategy. They colluded, not necessarily intentionally, to create of himself such a vile figure that then the institutions kind of lost a lot of integrity from my mind, or from my point of view, because they didn't engage truthfully or with the facts. And at the same time, let's just say with CNN, they had a huge hate boner, sorry, that's a technical term, for Trump, and yet that hate boner is what they were profiting from. And then, okay, so if you disregard, if you just can't get your head around Trump being anything other than a villain, if you look at what happened in 2020 with COVID, and then with the Black Lives Matter protest, specifically the Black Lives Matter protest in the summer of 2020, it was absolutely obvious, undeniably obvious. And it even became a meme. They turned themselves into a meme. Fiery but mostly peaceful protests, right? And
Yes.
then, so CNN and the Democrats are, I think, feeding the fires of the flames, and I think that they had a strategy to do that in order to either provoke Trump so they could call him a fascist for, stopping people from burning down inner cities, or to put the American populace in such a fragile state of mind that they just need to get Trump out, and then everything's going to be normal again. It was a great game. Grand game that they were playing, but it was completely dishonest, very propagandistic. And anybody with the head on their shoulders who was not just being spoon-fed or not allowing themselves to be spoon-fed the mainstream media was wise to this. So all of that, they get their way, they get Biden in power, and yet they still can't, and yet they're still like not able to tell the truth even then. I'm kind of losing the thread here, but I'm just trying to paint that there was all this really fishy stuff going on, and then it culminates, and I think something about Elon Musk, he trumped them in a way and just started pulling down their pants, and he was in such a position of power. But you're also saying that he's not alone in thinking this and in exposing what he's exposing and forcing the legacy institutions into kind of displaying themselves as corrupt or dishonest. He's not, I don't know what's fueling him, but you're saying that he's not alone from the tech sector. So.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I think a word you use here, forcing, is exactly the right thing. Because we kind of have this conception of these kind of legacy institutions, or of the individual journalists in this legacy institutions, as kind of rational actors. At least a lot of people who I interact with, a lot of tech people, a lot of kind of libertarian types, they have this kind of like rational actor model, and they apply it everywhere, and it's just false, and it's like evidently false from just like either the economic numbers, from the revenue numbers from these legacy institutions, or from basically like any other analysis. You can't really square this being like so irrational, right? It's just they're just playing like a losing strategy from a winning hand, and what actually explains it is that these institutions are not kind of like ships that are being steered. They're more like a school of fish. And if you've ever watched a school of fish, sometimes like one fish will just like randomly like catch something out of their eye and they like chase after it, and every other fish just chases after them in this kind of like very very beautiful pattern. And it is beautiful in a way. Because that actually gets to the second layer of this kind of triangle, which is how the kind of quote unquote midwits or the journalists, most kind of mid-tier academics, most bureaucrats, what their kind of key motivation is. Because there's this idea in sociology called, this was on I think Charles Fane Lehman on Richard Hanania's show. I think it was something like the legitimacy, or like the argument of legitimacy, or something like that, or the justification of legitimacy. Where people are not making decisions within institutions based on what is going to increase their revenue numbers. That's more like the decision of rationality, or the justification of rationality, but rather in this kind of explicit conformist way of saying like, oh, everyone else is doing this, how about we do it as well? And that's really what is motivating all of this. So if you look at what Elon is doing, Elon is kind of driving the news cycle by recognizing this fact that has long been known to politicians of every party, of every stripe, for decades, that there is this school of fish dynamic. And then he puts out this kind of bait, like literally like a bait. And
I'm not going to vote Democrat ever again. I'm going to vote Republican, right?
Yeah, even like the meme from like Colin Wright, the kind of moving leftward meme, and they're not necessarily like completely accurate. They're like memes after all. But you have this situation where he's just like he understands how this works now. He understands, and he has like the tools to experiment with it. And he really can like force the school of fish to move wherever he wants, and it's quite beautiful.
Okay, and well, we can't really necessarily, unless you want to, speculate as to his what he's trying to do. I mean, he says he's fighting for free speech. He wrote something like, "I'm fighting for you for free speech," and I'm like, yeah, are you though? I mean, I don't distrust you, and I kind of trust you, but whenever somebody says that they're fighting for me, I'm like, okay, this is a political move.
Yeah.
He's trying to own me. Yeah.
Well, at least Elon can't be president.
Yeah.
Well, so we have one possibility out of the running.
So there's this institutional dynamic like a school of fish, and they are just kind of easily played. The way that they're playing is, are you suggesting that the way that they're playing now, let's just say with Taylor Lorenz, who is this really bad journalist, she does terrible work. She doxes people and harasses people and then turns around and cries on the news about being doxed and harassed. I mean, it's so odd that she's so hypocritical that you can't even make fun of her. Like, it's got to be a game. Either that or she's psycho. But she is part of kind of like this Gawker era, lowbrow, Inquirer level gossip page journalism, but the institution of the Washington Post thinks that is what drives engagement, or that is the way to be now. We all kind of have to be kind of these really bratty, annoying, hypocritical, or at least, op-ed-y kind of entities. And somebody wrote a Substack post about, as soon as Elon Musk it became known that he was going to buy Twitter, or try to buy Twitter, the Washington Post wrote like 30 or 40 negative articles about him in a week. And it was just like, just blatantly biased. And what you're saying is that there's something in these institutions that is frustrating the people who are meritocratic and tech-minded, who are applying this kind of rational actor motivation to try to understand that, but they're still really frustrated with it.
Yes.
And how can that ever change unless we change the incentives? If everybody's going to be a school of fish no matter what, then it would be best to guide them by bait or to facilitate a certain pattern of movement that would align to your impulse control conservatism.
It's not always a school of fish. It is in specific a school of fish. It is right here, right now, a school of fish. And here is why I think this kind of triangle is so important. The kind of instinct, and then conformity or mimesis, as the kind of cool kids say today, and then this kind of like optimization ideology, which I think a lot of not just tech people actually, but CEOs in general have, and that has actually a lot of blind spots. I'll be critiquing in upcoming episodes as well. But essentially, I don't think it has to be this way at all. It can be something that is like quite different. I think I'm quoting Richard Hanania again as well. I think he's done a lot of insightful work, and he had this article I think called like the smart case for dumb populism or something like that, where he's essentially talking about the same things that I am with the midwit meme, which is that when you have essentially institutions that select for people who will join the school of fish, right, who will not do something different, who will not basically either right go to this optimization ideology, which is kind of like the rationalists or the kind of libertarians or whatnot, or go to this kind of like deeply felt ideology. So essentially, like they're choosing people who are close as possible to the blank slate, right, of people who can be like, who will like be subjugated to these kind of social pressures into these institutions. Then of course the institutions are going to act like a school of fish, right? It's like saying like you choose people who are like left-handed, and then they're all to like go into your army, and then they're all like holding their guns in their left hand. Like wow, what a coincidence. No, of course not, right? And if you have, this goes back to the Hanania case, in a lot of these situations there's this kind of like low class, or this kind of like stigmatized, to use probably like a left-wing term, kind of populism, where people are kind of like wild and they're getting things wrong and they're like being like chill, right? It's kind of like the Joe Rogan ideology of being very chill and getting things wrong and being open about getting things wrong, right? There's kind of like by the optimization ideology people, there's kind of like a aversion to that, and it's an aversion that I had as well for a long time. But really kind of like being like very honest with myself and saying like, okay, what have kind of my actions wrought, right? What have my actions in the kind of optimization game, basically like serving this like bureaucratic power center, like what has that gotten us? And like, what would be worse about having a more kind of like Hanania-esque case for populism? It's like, actually, no, the latter is just better.
Okay. So I want to step back to a previous culture war topic called wokeness, critical social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion, gender ideology, queer theory, critical theory, Marxism. There is a way of looking at that as a tremendous existential threat to our institutions and to our country. The values that it promotes and the way that it promotes them are highly problematic. If you look at what happened at the Evergreen State College, and if you look at what happens kind of in the DEI stuff with like Coca-Cola having people, like white people, like, do the whole thing where they're shamed for being white or guilty for being white. These ideas, very offensive when I first came across them, and then very dangerous when I witnessed them in action. But the more I look at them and the more I look at how they're actually implemented, they're being implemented by these midwit bureaucrats who don't do anything but just spew these terms and have like kind of more or less emotion stuff. And they don't actually, there's something about the bureaucratic system that has adopted wokeness that is producing schlock. It's not actually dangerous. It's just lame. Like ultimately it's not an existential threat. The real existential threat is that we are going to experience a brain drain, right? Of anybody who can't go through. I think that like in the Gen Z who are going through college right now, so many of the most talented open, creative minds are going to not get degrees because they know that in order to get their master's degree, they're going to have to do 5 or 6 extra years of all this social justice bullshit. Like that social justice bullshit that's being implemented in the college, and also the very authoritarian COVID response, specifically in colleges, I think is going to select out of colleges or out of the degree centers people who are mavericks, people who are inventive, who are more or less open, who are nonconformist. So the institution itself is going to create all these nominal Marxists and then install them into the prestige institutions, but they're not going to be the creative people. I just think that it's going to destroy itself. So what's going to happen outside of those prestige institutions? Yarvin would say that they're always going to be here. They're going to keep on lumbering. And when I brought up, like, what about the podcast circuit? You know, what about the IDW loosely defined, like where individuals prove through merit their ability to make sense of the world and provide content for other people? Like, can't that be the selective pressure that kind of overthrows or at least dethrones the prestige institutions?
Precisely right. And are you ready to be white-pilled, audience?
Okay, well, 1 second. Like, okay, and I just want to put this out there that we would need backing. Like the podcasters, the YouTubers would actually need backing from people in power. Like we would need the
hey,
tech
Thiel,
bros
send us
to
some
actually,
money.
Yeah, exactly. We'd need a Thiel or or an Elon to actually take over YouTube and say we're gonna clean. It's a marketplace of ideas. The algorithm's gonna be designed to try to find good information and put that up regardless of the name behind it. Okay, so white peel.
Yeah, so I'm kind of on the ground talking with a lot of my fellow Zoomers, about disproportionately in tech, yes, but also in kind of academia and social science as well, because I do have an interest in those, and honestly, like a lot of engineers as well. And there is the most fertile, like there was a kind of optimism about ending like legacy institutions within for millennials, and that was kind of unfounded. But I think with Gen Z in particular, there's a much more open embrace of the kind of rigor and the kind of selection that you need to do in order to build an alternative. So what do I mean by that? All of this is very abstract. What do I mean by that? I mean that there are a lot of people aged kind of like 20 to 25 or like 15 to 25, whatever, or like 25 and younger in general, who can look at like a New York Times hit piece and can look at someone's GitHub page and decide which one is more important and decide correctly. And the answer is the GitHub page is much more important. There are people, like, take the story of like Andian Majekovic or whoever, who actually came from my alma mater, apparently. I never knew the guy.
The disinfo chick.
No. Completely different person. It's a guy. Okay. He's apparently like 18. It's crazy. And he's 18. He was doing like his master's degree. And there was recently another article about this, but he essentially did like an exploit, like a trading exploit, where he managed to like put in a bunch of crypto coins onto like basically like one company's quote unquote like smart contract, which is basically their code, and then withdraw a bunch of other crypto coins that were worth much more money, and then basically make a ton of money off of that. Now that company is like suing him for their own like kind of stupid like technical failure. They're like suing this like 18-year-old kid, and he's just like, nope, this is illegitimate, and he's just like fled the country apparently. And even if they catch him, this is kind of like the nature of cryptocurrencies. They can't get him to disclose his password, right? There's no way, like, I don't know, like unless they do like some kind of torture on him, which I don't think is going to happen, right? There's no way of getting it back, and he's just going out and he's saying like this is illegitimate. Now, he is not necessarily like I'm actually like less bullish on crypto than I think a lot of people in my generation. But the point is not to agree with the means to which he is kind of changing the system. The main point is to talk about the willingness to change the system. these people that people see this kind of distribution of prestige or of legitimacy as fundamentally empty, as literally mattering zero. And that has a lot of positive side effects. It means they're much more willing to build. It means they're much more willing to talk about interesting ideas. And quite frankly, it means that they're like just much more competent. Because if you look at what these... Man, I really don't want to sound like... I don't want to sound like a doomer on these universities, partly because like my alma mater and also like MIT, like University of Waterloo and MIT, the places where I have the most friends, they're actually kind of functional still, right? They're not completely flooded with ideology. There's actually like minimal, especially in the kind of like math department and the computer science department, which I mainly traverse. They're still functional, but there's this other thing happening where the informal networks that are built up are becoming the primary ways of creating value. The informal networks, basically, I know a guy who knows a guy, and this isn't just like sheer nepotism. This isn't like family. This is like, I know a guy from working on this kind of like tech project, or from working on this newsletter together, or working on a paper together, like a heterodox paper or whatnot, right? Yeah. And the ease of referencing people to other people is creating this really renaissance of thought that is both unconstrained by a kind of school of fish ideology, but also not succumbing to the blind impulse and kind of like destructive noise, I think, that really characterizes like politics, basically.
Okay. Yeah. So, well, there's a couple places I want to go with that. So places like Brown University, is it Brown? Yeah. Brown and Yale, the law schools, we see evergreening happening there, like these prestigious institutions. There's these students that are pretty well off. I mean, they're freaking Brown and Yale, but like they get offended by somebody at a bar says that somebody else is racist, and then they
I hope to have
mob a bar. What?
Yeah, I think you're talking about Aaron Sibarium's reporting, right, from the Washington Free Beacon. I hope to have him on my show as well. Okay. But yeah, you have these kind of incidents. And the story I like to tell, this is a story that a friend actually showed me very recently, is that a completely anonymous account on the University of Waterloo subreddit, once again, this is my alma mater, posted about doing like a nude streak throughout a building in Waterloo. And 300 or 400 people showed up to the event to watch this guy. That sends a very clear message. If your protest is not getting as many people as Nude Dude 69, it should be completely ignored. It means nothing.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so similarly, and this aligns with my trajectory as whatever I'm doing with this channel. Is that like I saw this terrible event, this evergreen thing. I tried to report on it, and then I started reporting or investigating other instances of woke gone wrong, and then participating in, before it became cool, I was kind of anti-woke, and then I found myself like being anti-woke, and then there was this anti-woke thing, and then I focused on gender, and then when I went into the gender debate, I'm like, I don't want to just be the person posting a bunch of weird pictures of dudes who think they're women doing crazy things. I mean, there's that kind of culture war, but there's no real substance to that other than driving attention and leaning into that instinct of repulsion from the audience, and then also just being repulsed all the time myself and being anxious and stuff like that, and being involved in anti-wokeness. It's like, okay, well, this is just instinct. It's just power. It's just games of power. This is not actually changing anything. This is, well, not even not changing things. Maybe it is changing things to a certain degree, but it's not actually doing the work of investigating issues in a way that would change how the culture goes. It's just being frothy on the surface. So I kind of disengage, and I'm kind of like, I don't want to be anti-woke anymore because that's not actually doing the thing. What's doing the thing? It's like, okay, what are the ideas? What are the ideologies? What is the root of progressivism? What's the root of conservatism? And how do we start to interact and give people like solid views of politics and ideology that's not just culture war version of politics and ideology?
Right.
And then inevitably that just leads me to conservatism. I'm like, well, they're the counterculture now. It seems like the right side of things. They're more free and they're more fun, and there's some really interesting ideas there. And then you have to say, well, where are the fascists and where are the white supremacists? Because they're there too, but I haven't really found them totally, but I know that they're there, but it's like the Wild West over there. But that's where culture comes from. That's where the avant-garde is the Wild West outside of the institutions.
Right. So The biggest problem outside of the institutions, I used this phrase before, subsumed by the noise. And I think that's very much what happens there, is that you have these very powerful appeals that amount to nothing.
What do you mean?
You have these kind of impulse, you kind of have these impulse stories like the Disney stuff, for example. And what did we actually end up doing? We ended up, or like, let's say like Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis and his government ended up like abolishing basically their kind of like special tax zone and whatever. And this actually like mainly just impacts like normal like Floridians. This doesn't actually impact the company all that much. It might actually benefit them because it reduces their kind of like the sales tax that they had before. So what this is that we actually have a very familiar term for describing it. It's virtue signaling. Virtue signaling is the inevitable endpoint when you get subsumed by the noise. And it's not just the right that does this, that ends up piling all this emotional energy onto these kind of like measures that don't actually work. They pass the measures that don't actually work, and then the emotional energy dispels, and then they're no better for it.
Yeah.
And they're just exhausted and anxious and so on and so forth. And you can see kind of like, this has been actually kind of funny. And I actually wrote a piece, let's talk about the news story first. This kind of like news story about the Black Lives Matter organization founders buying like a $6 million house with the charity money. And I wrote an article which basically said like, we should kind of encourage political enemies to do this, because the more that happens, the more this kind of frustration, the more this kind of like self-destruction happens, really like the more disengaged and the more like rightfully, I think in many cases, disassociated their movement becomes. And I would actually say that this is also pretty much true for the kind of like far right people who I obviously disagree with. The really kind of like insane people on really any side, we should kind of like encourage them to like subtly scam themselves as long as like everyone else isn't left holding the bill for them, which of course is like what people try to do when they actually take over institutions. So where do we go from that? So that's the problem. That's the problem of creating a new institution, of creating a kind of counterculture. So where do we go? Where do we create some kind of institution? Well, a synonym for institution really is order, right? What is a family relation? What is a work relation? What is a government relation? It is an order, right? It is a path where you expect to gain a thing and you offer something in exchange. This sounds a little bit too marketish, right? I don't want to do that either. Like that's like very wrong. That implies like a rational kind of sense, right? But it's not quite that. It's like a pattern of behavior. It's almost like a script, but it's more dynamic than that. I want a term to describe this, but I don't have
procedure.
Procedure, yes, but that's still too close to a script, because people are not operating off of it just like mechanically, right? They're much more live, as Sam O'Buria would put it. They're much more of a live player.
Yeah, there's a set of values and then a set of expectations. So like internal values and then cultural values. So there's internal drives, and then people have to be self-organized first. So they have to actually go through a process of like learning about their drives and learning how to properly control them, which would be kind of socialization. So once they have mastery over themselves, then they are incentivized by the culture around them in order to act in certain ways. And then in aggregate, all those people acting in all these different ways, not necessarily rational, but not rational, but also, you have room for the school of fish and the instinct, right? But it's all kind of trained in this kind of value set that then produces some sort of coordinated action, or otherwise we can just say culture, that then produces great product or content, whatever it is.
That's right? What we're doing here. We're producing great content. Yeah. So subscribe to Ben's channel. But
and Cactus,
yeah, culture is great. Culture is a great term, and I think it's exactly the right amount of ambiguity for the discussion we're having, because of course we're not completely certain of what we're doing, right? I'm not going to say like, here is precisely the institutions we should build, precisely the people who should form them and the rules that they should operate by. Yeah. I have neither the competence or the power to have that kind of dictatorial control.
But you can, or you could describe the feeling of when you're in that group or in that network. And you can also describe kind of how that network is operating and the feeling of it operating.
Right. So I think there's kind of two things that we need to collect, that we need to understand, and then branch them, kind of like merge them together. And one is like actually how a startup functions, because there's this mythology of how a startup functions. And I think Yarvin talks about this quite a lot, about the kind of what he calls monarchy, but which is essentially like a hierarchy where ultimately one person is accountable, and each person is accountable to the person above him until the top person, who is ultimately accountable through being a shareholder, through having put money in, having skin in the game, and so on and so forth. And that is a semi-accurate mythology, or I would say an incomplete mythology of how startups function. Because by the time you have that kind of rigid aligned structure, it kind of already is a thing. It exists. The creation is done, and there's scaling, there's growth, of course, and there's like a transformation as it becomes bigger and bigger. But the fundamental act of creation is done. It's done. So the thing that we are trying to win, we've already won. Right. So what does this tell us? It doesn't tell us that much, actually. Right. But I think it gives us some insights onto where we are trying to get to as a kind of intermediate goal.
Okay, so just to go back over your analogy. So a startup comes up with an idea, it works really hard to get that idea to market, and then once it's to market, then the business is the business, and the product is the product. And then you have something like Google or Apple or Microsoft that go around, and at a certain point, because they get so big from their original idea, that they just start globbing up every other thing. And then they're kind of like this meta monster thing that's just gobbling up all these other ideas. But that's a different transformation, or that's a different scale. What we're trying to compare that to is Yarvin's idea of the monarch or the CEO. Everybody's accountable up the chain, and then the CEO is accountable to everybody else or to the market or something like that. And you're saying that that's not an accurate way of describing how this counterculture, or this kind of procedural culture that's actually producing good content, good works, let's just say, is necessarily going to operate.
Yeah. So by the time you're at kind of the startup level of success, you're maybe a Megyn Kelly or like a Breaking Points, like Crystal and Sagar, or like a Ben Shapiro. Even he's even like further down that road. But these are people who kind of already like quote unquote won, right? So by the time we get to the kind of startup scaling of institutions, we're already doing pretty well. That's not to say that we're going to ignore it, but I think that it's quite effective already. What we are doing with the period beforehand, like that's the second question, right? That's the second part, or I guess maybe it's actually the first part of what we're considering here, the first half. And so what are we doing with this? I don't completely know. I am doing my best. I'm doing a podcast. I'm putting together kind of people who I hope to eventually inspire to do similar things. I am kind of applying for these kind of fellowships and such. I am going on all of these different podcasts. And so what do we call that? Do we call it like networking? No, that sounds a bit too corporate. Do we call it like socialization? Wait, no, that means something else. Um,
Mhm.
I don't know. I haven't coined it. This is a very big problem. I'm not actually that great with words.
Okay, so what you're
Um,
describing on a massive scale, we're just breaking down into just you or I, saying I start to speak into a microphone and
yes,
people hear me and they want to talk to me more. And
they
so,
do. I'm joking.
well,
I'm joking.
right? It just goes back and forth and back and forth, and you start to get an audience, right? But
Yes.
you're not yet a name. You become more and more of a
Hmm.
known quantity, but this is happening on a massive scale. There's thousands and thousands of people doing that, and in doing that, they're not just building a brand, they're not just empty suits or talking heads, they're actually organizing things or bringing knowledge into being or into awareness and doing it on a massive scale. And because they're
Yes.
talking to each other. And then they kind of sort into these different networks where if there's a cultural flashpoint, then people start to organize tribally around, let's say BreadTube versus the anti-woke thing, or like LawTube. There's this thing called LawTube
What's
now.
LawTube? I mean, I can
LawTube is
guess,
just
but
a
like,
bunch of lawyers just doing
yeah.
videos about all the funnest cases that are out there, and then
Oh,
they
is that
have
like
one
a
big
like Pope hat?
network. I think it's Rakita Law and a bunch of other people that I don't have names for, but I mean, you see that emerging last year with the Rittenhouse trial, and now with
Hmm.
the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp thing. So these people
I
are
see.
making content out of phenomena, and then they're kind of bringing knowledge to bear. And then you have like kind of old school YouTubers who are just kind of debate bros, kind of, Vouch and Destiny,
They're like Twitch
they're
streamers
doing,
now, right? Yeah.
yeah, they're doing something. They're kind of promoting some sort of ideology. Sargon's an interesting case. Carl Benjamin, he was big in the Gamergate thing. He kind of, did some pugilistic, getting in trouble and kind of, just being controversial. And then at some point he decided to mature, and now he kind of does his own thing where it's basically kind of a boarding school where he's just
Huh.
getting people, historians and other academic minded guys and some girls too together, and they're kind of creating just this knowledge base of discussion, and they call it lotuseaters.com. So he's doing a particular path that's similar to Ben Shapiro, who's doing the college circuit, got big on YouTube, and then became a commenter. Now he's got an organization behind him. So what we're trying to describe is that there's all these people doing basically the same thing, but there's something greater that is actually not just a threat in a negative sense, but a possible replacement for the previous media machine.
Yeah. So yeah, I basically agree with most of that. I just had a reaction to that kind of last sentence. The previous, like the quote unquote previous media regime, that's a very good way of describing it because it's like it's already on its way out. It's in transition. It's kind of dying its last breath. Uh, and I think we've kind of like not noticed that. We've kind of like wheeled it out in front of people, right? Like we've kind of
Hmm.
wheeled the media's corpse in front of people. Maybe this is like a very nice metaphor, right? Um, and like I said, it's just a matter, or okay, I don't want to say it's just a matter of time because it might be a matter of a long time, but you
Hmm.
have a growing understanding that there is no more legitimacy there. All we have to do,
Well, no more legitimacy than anywhere else.
yeah, basically, or like not even that. I think there are other institutions that do have some legitimacy, or I do think there are actually even like some legacy institutions which have held themselves up better. Like I said, MIT is probably the leading one of them in the United States, uh, and there are some other kind of. I think like Stanford has been doing all right.
University
And
of
this isn't to
Chicago's
like
sticking to their
endorse. Oh
guns
yeah, that's
too.
interesting as well. It's been an interesting experiment,
Yeah.
as well as like UATX. There's this kind of like new thing that's popping up, right? Or actually, like the old like University of Austin is actually quite interesting as well, right about now. George Mason, yeah, there are these kind of old centers that have adapted, and you see this happening with every kind of phase change in technology, right? You have some people who actually do learn how things work, um, but yeah, you have a lot of these legacy institutions which are really not respected at all, or even like a sign of like low culture at this point, and we're waiting for like a step phase. Now I don't want to be kind of like I don't want to be over optimistic and say that like, oh, this is inevitable. Like I don't want to do the same thing that like Democrats or whatnot have been doing with kind of like demographic change until they lost all of the demographic change, right, in the votes.
Yeah, that's funny.
But yeah, there is this kind of optimism on the rise. I think something that I want to be clear about is that you might have like people who occupy legacy institutions not necessarily changing, but that's because their legacy institutions. What the real change is happening is like how many people are loyal to these institutions, like fundamentally loyal. How many of these people would like choose these institutions over like as I said, like a friend's GitHub page? Like that number is decreasing, and that's a wonderful thing, and it's decreasing quite sharply.
But it's but there are failures to the new way of doing things because you don't have editorial control. Which, if the editor is a good editor, then that editor is going to be putting things in place where there's fact checking and there's coherence made out of the world. And if the editor is bad, there's going to be manipulation of the media to create a specific result. Substack doesn't have that editor. Right. YouTube doesn't have that editor. Twitter doesn't have that editor, but there is a replacement to the prestige and its status. And how is status gained? It's by constant interaction over time and getting known as somebody who purveys content. And when, like you were bringing up with Joe Rogan, if that person makes a mistake, they'll be lynched by a certain crowd, but the crowd's not lynching them for the mistake. The crowd's lynching them out of envy or out of power, a power play. But Joe Rogan's legitimacy is gained by his status, right?
Yeah.
And it's also attacked because he has status.
Yes. So the question of quality and editorial control is a very difficult one, and it's so difficult that it's never been solved ever in history. So a stat that I like to believe, or a question that I like to ask semi-rhetorically, is what is the greatest, most widely believed conspiracy theory in all of modern American history since we started polling, basically?
That we landed on the moon.
I actually thought I asked this last time, but maybe not. No, the greatest conspiracy theory, most widely believed conspiracy theory in modern American history is that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And this wasn't a conspiracy theory that was spread by social media. I hope it wasn't by Russian trolls, although I don't know, who knows? Maybe that's the real Russiagate all along. But no, I don't think it was spread by Russian trolls. I don't think it was spread by kind of Joe Rogan or podcasts or celebrities or unfettered conversations. We all know how it was spread because they bragged about it. It was spread by passing very like low quality reports from intelligence agencies to politicians. Politicians passed it to media who did none of their jobs, who did not speak truth to power, repeated lies from power. And then those trusted media companies distributed that conspiracy theory of a conspiracy that was incredibly implausible and had no evidence to back it up to the general public. And 90% of us believed it. Now, how does that problem get solved by creating alternative institutions? Well, not that well. I think people are still going to be wrong about things. There's this like very interesting result. I think it was on it might have been on humanprogress.org, but I'm not completely sure. Of like what is the percentage of the population that believes in like quote unquote conspiratorial beliefs, and how does it change over time? And there's, of course, this kind of misnomer or this kind of misbelief, I guess, misinformation floating around that people have had like a sharp increase in how many conspiracy theories believe in, right? Or how many people believe in at least one. And that's not really the case. It's been kind of like static over time, maybe increasing like a tiny amount. But it's been like more or less the same. And So you ask yourself, like, where are these conspiracy theories manifesting in all of history? Well, sometimes they've manifested in other countries without as much of a rule of law. Sometimes they've manifested in kind of like niche circles and like terrorist attacks, and those are bad. But we've had the solution to those, which are just like democracy. I think democracy actually still works. And
Hmm.
like basic like policing, right? Basic like rule of law, as I said, and that has happened. That has been fine throughout the past. And I think like if you actually look at a step change of what is happening, things number one, things are actually like not that bad, right? If we just look at the amount of political violence compared to the past, compared to things like the Weather Underground, things like the
Hmm.
IRA in Ireland, things like the FLQ in Canada, right? There have been like very real political terrorist movements throughout history, and we're nothing close to that. Of course, I don't want to get anywhere near that, but our institutions are kind of working. Like the actual like institutions in terms of like a very obvious job, right? Like literally prevent. I mean, you can argue like whatever FBI is like not the same as it used to be, like sure. But we kind of have the intuitions of how to do this, or we kind of have like the trial tested means of how to do this well. And we have the kind of technology, we have like legacy institutions that are actively eroding them. And we have alternative institutions that like they're not perfect, they're nowhere close to perfect, but
Yeah.
you kind of have to live with them. You kind of have to live with human nature, and this is
Okay, so
the kind of like most impactful thing that Richard Tanania has basically like convinced me of.
you have to live with human nature.
Yes.
Okay. So, or would you mind letting me know if you're still in Canada?
Yes.
Okay, so Canada, it's a north of us, being the United States. You guys have a fraction of our population, smaller, gentler, kinder folk. Your government decided that COVID was a existential threat to the population, and so granted itself emergency powers over population. Decided to implement broad scale authoritarian, and I just mean that simply like you have to obey or you lose rights. You can't fly out of the country or into the country without a vaccine. So far as I know, you have to be behaving all these different ways, and the government's pretty
I'm
darn
not sure if
tight.
the testing regime is still up as well. That was something that was like quite
Where they
crazy.
were testing everybody constantly, and you'd had to have
Yeah,
nurses come to your house and
test
get
to
you
travel,
swabbed in.
it's like kind of
Okay.
incoherent because the vast like once you hit some kind of like very low threshold of cases, like controlling your borders doesn't really make any sense. Like I don't know why I have to tell like a left wing government this, but it's just like not very effective, right? Just
Well,
like
that's the thing. And
empirically not
then
very effective.
let's ratchet it up. And this is probably, well, hopefully it's just a special circumstance, but it's pretty novel to me or pretty worrisome to me is that you had that trucker protest a few months ago where the
Mhm.
truckers came and they danced in the streets and they had jacuzzis and they, fed each other and had this communal gathering, and they were portrayed by your government. Well, your authoritarian dictator, Justin Trudeau, he called them racists and dehumanized them pretty explicitly, and then would not speak with them, fled, got pretend COVID for 2 days, came back and just kind of began to seize their assets. He had his government begin to seize the financial assets of the protesters. A government that starts to do that is not the same as the New York Times publishing a bunch of shitty op-eds or Taylor Renz like doing hit pieces and then crying about having hit pieces done to her. Or it's not even on the same level of a disinformation board that out the gate is filled with disinformation and then accuses disinformation of disbanding it. Whatever happened with Trudeau, those truckers in that financial system, and then the whole thing with the World Trade Organization or whatever, the Davos thing with the the what are they called, the Charles Schwab,
World
like
Economic
the
Forum.
World Economic Forum, right? There's something worrying there that's of a completely different order of seriousness when the government begins to control its citizens in that way. That I don't know. Are you saying that the citizens are going to be able to change that, or that that authoritarian move is not to be taken seriously because we have other ways of making sense and making authority and making legitimacy through podcasts?
Okay, so there are a lot of questions there. So,
Yeah.
COVID measures originally, trucker protest, seizing assets, and Emergency Powers Act, and then like what is the interplay with like networks basically? Or like I don't think the World Economic Forum stuff is like not very relevant at all. Like I think most of them have been like not really well put together. Like I don't think they're very coherent. Once again, like they're okay, this is kind of like going back to like what I talked about on the last episode. And actually this plays into the authoritarianism, like the quote unquote authoritarianism stuff as well, is that like you actually have to be like pretty competent to execute an authoritarian system, right? Yeah. You have to have like an ability to coordinate and do things well. And like here's the problem with conspiracy theories. It's not that they're people who have bad intent, because obviously there are, right? There are like murderers, there are like actual sadists out there who would probably do terrible things to humanity if they could. But here's the thing, they simply cannot. Right? They do not have the competence. They do not have like the organizational skill. They could not, like we were talking about the same people who did like healthcare.gov, right? Or not in the case of Canada, but like when you have a lot of these kind of legacy institutions, they're just, the people in them are just not very good. Now, if you had like Elon as president or something like that, then maybe this is like the case against Elon, is that like you don't, maybe if someone is like very competent and very adept at using power, then you start worrying. But actually, okay, let's. So that's the kind of like World Economic Forum stuff. I think it's almost all bunk, right? I think. Or like,
well, I'm just saying that how would this network affect challenge something like Trudeau and his behavior?
Yeah. So on the original COVID measures, I think like it's quite a difficult scenario, because there can be actual there can be scenarios where they are actually justified. At least the original COVID measures, not necessarily the seizing assets. I grouped that into a separate category. But the original COVID measures, they could be somewhat justified. And the real question is judgment, right? Because you have two scenarios, right? One where there is there can be like a much deadlier virus, which will actually like kill everyone if not controlled. And you need to be able to do something about that, especially if you have a competent leader. So that's scenario A. And scenario B is that you have like a much weaker virus, or like basically like a post-vaccine COVID virus, right? Or like even just like normal Omicron now, where the major risk is of like a kind of overreaction, a failure to do cost-benefit analysis whatsoever, and inflicting much more economic destruction, which of course impacts people's everyday lives and causes people to die, than would have been the effect of the virus. And you have to have a set of both explicit laws and of norms that can resolve your problems in both those situations. Now, what does that look like? You can't really kind of theory craft this, right? There's so many completely unknown possibilities, incentives, exchanges. So what can we do? We can approximate from what seems to have worked. I would argue that the United States seems to have worked quite well. And I would argue that there is a kind of competing model which worked quite well to a point, which is the kind of Chinese model. And then what do I think of Canada? Well, Canada understands that it doesn't have the kind of competence or the desire to execute a kind of Chinese model, but it doesn't have the kind of true subsidiarity necessary to operate under the kind of American model, right, where you had essentially governors taking a different path. I would have preferred that model for most of the pandemic, if not all of it. So the initial kind of measures on that Trudeau implemented, like they're going to have to be available for some circumstances for national governments. I don't think you can really kind of like the first scenario still exists, even if it wasn't the one we faced right now, right? So I think you can't really do anything with those, but we can hope to have like eventually better bureaucracies. And of course, this takes political change. It takes training a group of people who are actually competent. It takes winning elections and then making sure that the politicians that you actually elect actually follow through on their promises and change the bureaucracy. This is kind of like the long game of political science. And yeah, we're not gonna have a change very quickly, unfortunately. But hopefully things will get better. And like, yeah, you can't draw a straight line from like, okay, we're going to have a better media environment. We're going to have less of the school of fish dynamic. And that guarantees that we're going to change the national bureaucracy. There's no guarantee there, but I think there is, and we aren't unreasonable to expect a correlation.
So the information economy, if it's changing in the direction that we've been talking about networking effects and people actually being competent, funny, open, inventive, creative, etc., getting their ideas out there, refining one another, providing access to the audience that this is possible, that might lead to the next generation like saying that, what school's teaching me is bunch of bullshit. These guys over here are actually engaging me mentally and then internalizing that and then going forth in the world. Some of them become either politicians or they start to vote for politicians that would then change the bureaucracy. So there is a feedback loop, possibly, potentially between the information economy as we've described it, as opposed to the legacy regime, and then a change in government.
Yes, that's exactly right.
And what you way back at the beginning, you were talking about these tech guys that are just so pissed off, and they're thinking, well, this other way is probably better. Do you see any change in the way that the people who have non-legacy power might facilitate a turnover or a change in direction?
Well, yeah, the first thing that's going to happen, I think, is this kind of realm of explicit kind of political corruption or like political influence on these kind of companies that really don't have anything to gain from them. So you saw like Shopify, you saw Coinbase, which, I mean, rip Coinbase, they're not their actual product might not be doing so good either. But you saw Coinbase, you saw Shopify, you saw a bunch of these other companies basically say like, okay, we are not going to have politics in this company, right? Which is basically saying like we reject any kind of external order that is being imposed on this company by kind of media pressures or by public pressures. And we are going to operate based on who are we selling stuff to, who are we, what are we doing in order to make money, obviously, and what products are we building? Okay, that's the first step. That should be the bare minimum. And it's becoming the bare minimum. It's becoming, I think, the ideology, or it's not
There's
even an
rumors that
ideology,
Netflix
really.
is going in that direction too. There's
Yeah, that's
rumors
very
and reports
interesting.
that Netflix is de-wokifying itself.
Yeah, that's very interesting. There was, I think, yeah, what you're referring to is the story about the memo talking, or not the memo, but like the letter to all employees, basically saying like you have to be tolerant of differing opinions and of differing content that you might not necessarily agree with. And yeah, that's a very interesting direction. I don't know anything about Netflix, but I think that's an optimistic sign as well.
I don't know to what extent Bezos has power over Amazon, but he's kind of following in Elon's wake and kind of
Yes, that's been
kind of
very funny.
yanking the rug under the Democratic establishment. And if he decided to nudge Prime away from woke content, which just sucks. The woke art is just so bad. Woke movies, woke Disney, they're just producing, again, like, it's not the Marxist threat that we imagine it is in this critical theory woke wasteland. It just doesn't produce anything that's inspiring when it actually
I should
produces
actually
content.
talk about this, because this is kind of what I've talked about before. I don't know how much I need to talk about it again, but there's this kind of like cycle of like overreaction that's just like very silly, where people like don't really understand what the actual threat is to their lives. They don't actually understand like what is the policies we need to change in order to undo these bureaucracies, and they're just kind of like reacting, and they're reacting in a kind of self-destructive like virtue signal way. And I think like a lot of this kind of like really like a lot of this anti-woke stuff, I mean, okay, like this is difficult to say because like there's a combination of like some diamonds in the rough with like just like very obviously self-destructive policies. Like for example, like there was this like bill in Texas that was like um, it was not only like classifying like I think like I don't even remember what it was, but it was basically doing like sending like Department of Child Protective Services against like basically like parents who want to have children who like identify as trans, right? And they want to get their surgeries. Now, whatever you think about like those people getting their surgeries, like the Department of Child Protective Services does everything wrong, is just completely dysfunctional, should probably be destroyed wholesale, if not, or like should probably be dramatically reformed, if not destroyed wholesale, should not be given more power in general, is highly politically influenced. Like, why are you empowering this organization? Like, this just makes no sense, right? This is kind of like one of the things that Ronald Reagan got right. It's like the 9 worst words from government are like, or like the 9 worst words are I'm from the government, I'm here to help. And there's a good reason for that. And Child Protective Services is like the epitome of that. And why are you handing over just more power to this bureaucracy? Like, this is just stupid. But yeah, you have this kind of desire to like scapegoat, and this desire to kind of just like there. I think there's like this very interesting quote. I don't remember who it was from, but basically that like you have this like very high like that when you have like very high like cynicism, you're also very when you have like very high cynicism, you're also very gullible, which is like a very strange thing to think about, but I think is actually empirically true. Like if you just actually like look out into the world, like people who are very like they have like they feel like they can't trust anyone, but they actually end up trusting people way too much, which is kind of like this self-contradiction.
Yeah,
but
well,
I think
people who feed into
world.
Their cynicism. Their cynicism.
Yeah, so that's the advice I would give to people who especially are like very angry. Like, first of all, like just kind of like take a deep breath, right? Like really like control yourself. It's kind of like almost like Petersonian, but like really like control yourself first, have an understanding of where your emotions coming from and your kind of like aesthetic tastes. Those are like fundamental, and you shouldn't necessarily try to like rid yourself of them, but also understand that you want to channel them towards something that will actually change how you or like change how those aesthetic tastes are in reality, right? And that step doesn't always happen, or that step actually I think very rarely happens, and that's like a problem with the noise, like what I call the noise machine, right? This kind of like constant like back and forth, and it like I know I kind of like brushed it under the rug with the kind of Hanania case earlier, but I do still think that it is kind of like basically like a less bad version of the status quo, but it's still like kind of bad. And I do hope people kind of like try to work on themselves and try to like transcend that.
What are you talking about, the culture war? Or...
Yeah, this kind of like impulse, this kind of like outrage machine, or this kind of noise machine, as I said.
Yeah, yeah, people could get tired of it and then find that there's a lot more to pay attention to that actually feeds them better. I mean, there is I don't know to what extent any given culture war issue is existential. I think that in 2020 I was in a state of anxiety and shock because everybody just started kneeling before the idol of this dead man in Minneapolis, and the amount of religiosity that happened in the wake of the death of George Floyd, and then all of those riots and stuff. But I knew after thinking about it, like, well, what happened at Evergreen? Like, there was a week of wild, and then a bunch of bureaucracy came in. That's all that's ever going to happen. It's just like more DEI. That's all. Like, okay, now we're going to just have a much more overpaid midwits professing this religion throughout our institution. That's all that's ever going to really change. The black community is going to suffer even more because they're not going to be given access to like actually building wealth. They're just going to be performatively pandered to, and then the people, like,
yeah, it's kind of worse than that. It's like they're stigmatized from going there, right? Like, this is the same thing I talk about. There are these kind of network effects, and like I'll be like very clear. I think the vaccine is like quite effective in preventing like death and hospitalization, right? And you ask yourself the question like, oh, why are so many why are so many conservatives dying from disproportionately of COVID, even when you control by age? And it's like, it's not a hard question, right? There's this distrust in this thing that I think is very clear, that it does work in preventing death and preventing hospitalization. And then you kind of look at the same thing. You kind of look at the same thing here, like, why is there such a problem? Why is there such a problem with minorities who are not doing well? And you just like think about it, and they're disproportionately like voting for the Democratic Party. And then you like think about it for like 5 seconds. And I think like if you haven't been like scripted with a preset answer to this question, whether it's a liberal answer or a conservative answer, and I think the conservative answer is also wrong, and like the far right answer is also wrong. But the answer is kind of obvious, and it's the same answer to that first question, and it's that like. It's that you have these narratives of institutional distrust, institutions that work, by the way, not just like these legacy institutions, but of like starting your own business, of just working well. And when they do go into the one institution that they actually promoted was the one that was bad, which was higher education. And they didn't even at least direct people towards the more productive degrees. Like there was just none of that done. People were just like, oh, just go to like any major, just any like that, like. I know like Curtis made this point when he was on your show as well, that if you like kind of looked at the development of Black wealth, you'd think that like, oh, this kind of like racist party took power, and that's why like that's why it's been like kind of a sharp decline. But no, it's that you've kind of spread these conspiracy theory narratives. They've been quite effective in winning political power, actually. These conspiracy narratives about like mass racism or whatever. Yeah. They've been very effective in winning political power, at least up to this point. We're very effective in winning institutional power. But what do conspiracy narratives actually do? Well, they hurt the people who believe them, and they cause those people to be separated by the means to which they actually would improve their own lives. And so I would be like, so yeah, this is like a very common problem. I think it's becoming like factually, it's not becoming more of a problem in that not more people are believing in conspiracy theories. But I think this kind of like political, the blaming of problems that are kind of self-inflicted, or not even self-inflicted actually, but inflicted by a member of a political coalition on another member of a political coalition. That's actually the correct framing. The blaming that, or the scapegoating of that onto the opposite political coalition, is rife within both parties. That is a very frequent pattern that I'm quite worried about in both parties.
And you say that it's well, you're worried about it, so it's dangerous or deflationary.
I think it'll lead to like very bad. I mean, we kind of want deflationary policy right now, right? But it'll lead to very bad policies being implemented. It may also lead to some kind of like terrorist attacks and such. But I'm more worried about like the bad policies will actually have more of an effect. They'll affect many more people.
Mm-hmm. So we went all over the place.
Yeah, this is like, the funny thing is I was completely unsure what to prep for, because I've just done so many things since I was last on, and there's a lot to talk about. But yeah, it's been quite a journey.
So plug your work now. Where can people find and listen to you? Read.
Yeah, so the new podcast is From the New World podcast, fromthenew.world. That's the URL. My writing is all at cactus.substack.com. And my Twitter is at cactus_chew.
And I believe last time we ended the recorded part of the interview with, I asked you some sort of question and I got a really funny answer out of you, if I recall correctly. So is there something?
Was it the lobsters thing?
Was it a lobster thing? Is there something that you've been doing that's not political?
Right. That was the question. But I don't think the question was that funny. I've been like I've been very into like composing music recently.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I've been, or like not just composing, but using the kind of like digital music environment. I think that's like, I don't think it's particularly good, but it's just interesting. It's like very, like I said, it's very aesthetic. There are these kind of deep preferences that you want to discover and you want to reveal to yourselves or to have revealed to you. And I think doing that and just enjoying it is it's a very excellent. It's just like a wonderful thing to do.
What genre or what instruments are you playing with?
I'm mostly doing kind of like, so there's this like genre of like basically like jazz remixes or remixes of like Japanese jazz songs. And so you get the instruments that you expect, right? And there's a lot of sampling involved, and I'm basically just like learning how to do this. I'm not very good at it yet, but this has been kind of my obsession in the past like week or two.
Oh, wow, cool.
Yeah.
Do you expect to post them somewhere on some sort of like Anano blog?
I don't expect to post them because at least so far they're quite bad. But it's still an interesting thing to explore. I like it.
Well, let's wrap up the interview. Thank you so much for coming on, Cactus.
Yeah, thanks for bringing me
very
on.
stimulating.
It's been great.
Very stimulating.